Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. Before we dive into the actual content of the session itself, I'd just like to make you aware of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Please feel free to ask questions throughout. We will be doing a Q&A section at the end of the presentation. Today, we're going to be covering desk utilization. The bulk of today's session will be led by my colleague Daniel. He is a part of the operations and deployment team here at OpenSensors, and we'll be exploring some of the ways that you can actually measure desk utilization and the importance of these studies. We'll be following quite a simple format. Firstly, looking at the steps you need to take to get started with these studies. Then we'll deep dive into the key metrics which need to be considered and what you can do to then leverage these metrics into tangible outputs. We'll then move on and share some practical tips surrounding increasing person-to-desk ratios before summing up the key takeaways and handing the floor over to you guys for the Q&A section. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, David. Before delving into the main topic of the webinar, I'd like to give a brief overview of the context. So why do we talk about desk utilization at all? The most obvious answer is, of course, costs. Leases the amount to the second largest expense in any organization. So any improved understanding of space occupancy can reduce these costs. But maybe the less obvious reason is that the work and workplace are changing. This change is fueled by the internet, employees who work from home, and new expectations. Technology is now enabling people to work from anywhere, anytime. And with virtual meetings on the rise and collaboration tools, which enable the flexibility of working from anywhere, employees use the space very differently, which can mean that you might find large areas in your office space underused and consequently losing millions. And therefore, the expectations change, the expectations for the workplace. For example, a growing number of people prefer now agile seating or work settings that match the tasks or project they are working on. So how do you match the expectations of those with those who prefer their own assigned seat? As employees get more and more mobile, it makes utilization rates fluctuate with low averages but high peaks. The industry average utilization rate is between 55 and 60%, which means that most organizations are potentially underusing at least or around 50% of their building space. How do you get started with measuring desk utilization? Step one in the process is to set goals. Why do you need the data? Is it because of an expansion? Maybe your company, an organization has acquired another company and you need more space. Is it because of a cost avoidance that a new lease is coming up that you would like to avoid? Or are you implementing a new workplace strategy, such as agile working? And the answer will tell you what data to measure. For example, if you're growing very fast and need quickly to get an overview of capacity, you might consider measuring utilization where there is pressure and you get a lot of complaints. Once you've determined your goals and what you would like to measure, factor installation lead times into your project plan, which can take between 4 to 8 weeks. Here at OpenSensors, we normally install after work hours or during the weekends to minimize disruption in the office. And to give you an idea, for a large financial services company, we installed 1,650 desk sensors over 6 floors in just 3 days. Immediately after the sensors are in your workplace, you are gathering data. We recommend at least 3 months of data before implementing any major changes in your workplace, because that will minimize the impact of seasonal variations. You will start to see immediate trends. Actually, only after 4 weeks, we say, look for the trends. And the things to look for are underused desks. It's what we call the low-hanging fruits. So where in the space do you see that space is underused? But also look at departments or offices in various locations, how they use space differently. And that is a very powerful foundation and powerful information when you're talking to department heads about their desk needs. Step 4, implement incremental changes. One example, if you have identified those underused desks, move them to another area or maybe into FlexiDesk so you can take off the immediate pressure if you're struggling with capacity. And finally, validate the early changes and iterate. Were the initial changes successful? Did you manage to lower the demand for space? And then the cycle continues. You go back, you look for trends, you implement, you validate, and you iterate. If you're interested in this particular topic, you might enjoy the previous webinar where we talked about how you can apply user experience principles when managing your workplace. And that webinar is available under the resource sections on our website.
Just before we move on to the next section, Dan, we've had a question pop up which fits in quite nicely. The question is, how long on average do people tend to have these solutions in place?
So I mentioned 3 months. That's the minimum we recommend to make any major changes to minimize seasonal variations such as holidays. But it is a long process. The whole process of identifying, implementing, validating, and iterating. And we normally work at least 12 to 24 months. And to give you an example, one of our customers, they have a 5-year plan to roll out agile working because culture change takes time. So they take small steps over a period of 5 years to roll out the agile working. So 3 months is the minimum to make some change, but it's really an ongoing process.
Well, hopefully, I imagine that answered the question. So let's move on to the next one.
There are a number of metrics that you can monitor and compare, such as comparing teams, departments, floors, buildings, or workspaces. And the first key metric is underused desks. Monitoring the number of desks used less than 20%, it lets you immediately make some decisions around repurposing them to elsewhere. In this example, 35 out of 239 desks are severely underused. And you can quickly say, move them over to flexi desks or move them over to another department where they're more needed. If you're struggling to convince department heads, this data and this metric makes for a very convincing conversation with them. The average desk utilization rate is another key metric. The industry average is between 55 and 60%. So you can easily benchmark your average utilization rate against the industry average. So you can then get a sense of your own success. It helps also to understand how much more you could be doing to optimize your workspace. Peak utilization and peak occupied, they identify the busiest period in the office in percentage and by desk count. They are very powerful because they enable you to plan for the busiest peaks when the most people are in the office. And something I'd like to draw your attention to, which is very, very interesting, is the discrepancy between average and peak utilization, because it shows how much the utilization of the space varies. The closer the gap, the more even the utilization is throughout the work week. Let's say if the average were 20%, but peak were 90%, the space would be severely underused, but suffer from extremely busy periods and peaks, which put a strain on the space. That could mean that employees are largely mobile, but come in all at the same time for meetings. And you can draw conclusions that the space is poorly designed for what the employees actually need. So a success indicator would be seeing the average and peak numbers come closer together. Below, you can see how the data can be categorized into departments and floors, and that helps you quickly build up departmental profiles and plan for what resources the various departments and teams need. So I want to share a case study to bring this a little bit more to life. We work with a company that recently moved into a new building, and they want to move towards an agile working environment, but also increase capacity within the existing space. The FM team, the facilities team, they strongly believe that there is more capacity, particularly in the sales department. And that's because manual surveys have showed that utilization was half of what the sales director said. They are promoting work from home and agile working, but they need data to make those changes. And after 4 weeks, we saw early trends. we're seeing that the space is actually very underused. It's 35% in average, so well below the industry average. So there's big scope for change. We saw that there were big differences between floors. So the least busy floor was 3 times less occupied than the most busy. So big variations across the floors. And indeed, the sales department was underused to 30% of the time. So the data, what kind of decisions did they enable? They created a plan, a data-driven plan, and among other recommendations was to relocate 30 desks from the sales department into a flexible desk area. Now, it was to take off the immediate pressure on capacity, but it was also the early steps towards agile working. The reports were very powerful to get stakeholder buy-in, as it became very clear that the space was underused despite the notion that it was at capacity. The new flexi desks from sales were used by departments with high utilization as an overspill buffer. The customer has still not leased a new building because they're now using the existing building more efficiently. Finally, the customer started building mobility profiles. Based on the employees' utilization, they're now understanding how they have different profiles, and that's become part now of the agile workplace plan. So tying the desk utilization into person-to-desk ratios, there are 2 methods that I would like to share with you guys today. The first method that we're looking at looks at departments as a whole, and it tailors the ratio based on the total utilization in that department. In step 1, you establish current and target utilization. And in step 2, we establish the ideal number of desks simply by dividing current peak utilization by the target utilization rate. The calculation will tell you how many desks you should have in this department for peak utilization to be 85%. In step 3, we calculate the new sharing ratio by dividing the total number of employees by the ideal number of desks. And our calculations there show that the optimal sharing ratio is 1 desk between every 2 employees, as this will ensure that the space is efficiently used, but also that everyone in the department has a desk at all times, because the peak utilization should now never go over 85%. If you have any questions, though, with regards to this calculation, just reach out to us after the webinar and we'll be happy to talk you through it.
We've actually had one just pop up, very relevant, so I might as well put it in now. The question is, it's to do with the 85% target utilization rate, and where did that come from in this case?
We often hear talk about target utilizations around the 80% or 85 or 88 is actually one that's come up recently. From our perspective, at least, that the target utilization rate will vary from business to business, and it really depends on the business objectives. There isn't an industry benchmark, at least that we would recommend, because it has to reflect the type of work environment you have. So if you have an activity-based environment versus a fixed desk collaboration and the size of the office. So instead of looking for the one true number, I would rather that encourage everyone to look into your own organization and establish that number based on what you need. The second method, it allows you to build mobility profiles directly from the utilization. So the same way we can build departmental profiles by tagging various sections, we can build mobility profiles of subsections in departments. So in the previous calculation, we look at a large department, there's around 200 people. And that's a good starting point, but for sure, among those 200 people, there are going to be different behaviors. So here we can look at subsections based on the utilization. For example, everyone who uses their desks more than 80% of the time, they could have, or they should maybe have their own assigned desk. And similarly, everyone who uses their desk less than 50% of the time will have a sharing ratio of 2 employees per 1 desk. And this approach can be used directly with the dashboard of utilization data. We're seeing here that the bank of desks with green dots on the left, they could have a sharing ratio of 1 desk per 2 employees. The bank of mostly light red or pinkish, they can have a sharing ratio of 1.2 desks per employee. And the bank of desks with dark red, they have assigned seats. And this enables you to plan for physical resources in the space, such as the furniture and technology that is required. It can inform what designs are actually working also, which can help you make purchasing decisions. What I want to end on is to say that it's all good having a beautiful space, which really looks good in magazines, but if no one's actually using the space because it doesn't really fit what the employees need, it doesn't have the right equipment, it doesn't have the right setup, it's not a productive environment.
We've just got a question come in relating to the two different methods. Can you speak at all about when each method would be more appropriate?
Yes. So I wouldn't say it's one or the other. I would say use them in conjunction. So the first method is really looking more large scale. So looking at departments or floors. But the second one is looking more granularly. So looking at subsets. So it could be a team. So in a department of 200 people, there might be 20 teams, and they might have very different requirements. So I would say use both together to get the best view of the ideal ratio.
So that concludes the body of the presentation. Just before the Q&A section, I'll do a quick roundup of the key takeaways. So the first question is, why examine desks in the first place? This goes back to what Daniel mentioned about low-hanging fruit within offices, meaning that as organizations near capacity, these low-utilized desks can be targeted relatively quickly in order to create significant space-saving changes, which can then help avoid costly and unnecessary expansions. Secondly, always follow the process. Before diving into data gathering and making changes throughout the offices, it's vital to spend the right amount of time examining what currently isn't working in your office itself. So looking at which areas can be optimized and establish what goals you want to reach by leveraging occupancy data in the first place. Implementing change is then an iterative process. You use the data to check the impact of changes you've already made, and then adjust and keep going as necessary. And finally, keep a close eye on your metrics. These metrics allow you to start to think about appropriate person-to-desk ratios between departments and floors. But moreover, if you take the time to tag or register each of your assets, you can start to see where the space is, but also what working environment different personas or departments prefer to be in. This information can then be used to actually inform many other decisions such as purchasing and design. We've got a number of questions that have rolled in which we haven't managed to slot in. Firstly, 5 to 12 weeks seems a long time to implement changes. Is this what you typically see?
Change takes time. Many of these organizations have strong traditions and wise to take the long-term view and take small steps and make small incremental changes. That's why you can start making changes after 3 months, but it takes time.
Yeah, okay. Is desk occupancy and utilization data captured in real time?
Yes, it is. So the data itself, it feeds through straight after installation. So with the online dashboard, the data is available and visible immediately after the deployment, and it comes through in real time. So as it happens, you can see it. So that's quite handy for live view. So when you have someone sitting down at a desk, you can have a live view, a screen or something that tells, all right, someone is working on that desk. So if someone's coming into the office and they want to find an available space, they can use that live view to navigate in the office.
Okay, perfect. Can you map desk sensors against floor plans, our own floor plans, so we can get a familiar view of what desks in our buildings are over and underutilized?
Yes, the way we work, we take the customer's floor plans and we basically feed it into the system, the dashboard, and then we dot each sensor on the floor plan. So that was the green and the red and the light green and red dots we saw earlier. So that would be your or the customer's floor plan. It's a very familiar view, and you get then a very visual representation of how the space is used.
Okay, we've probably got time for a couple more looking at it. One of the questions that come in is to do again with the dashboard actually. Can I download the data gathered in any type of file from the dashboard itself?
Yep, we're called OpenSensors. We're open, and we really believe in sharing the data as such. So the data can be downloaded in a CSV file, but it's also generally we're integratable. So we always strive to integrate into existing applications and systems, so the data can speak with other data sets.
Okay. We've got someone looking at quite large scale, which is always quite nice. I manage several office buildings around the US. How easy is it to compare desk utilization across these different sites?
Very possible. We have multiple customers with multiple buildings. The way it works is the sensors, the physical sensors themselves, have to be deployed in the buildings. So we have a deployment team that does that. But as soon as it's installed, the data from the multiple buildings, regardless of geography, they're coming into the same dashboard. So then you can spin up like-for-like comparisons where you can compare averages, peaks, teams, whatever you want to compare between the buildings in the same dashboard. It's very straightforward in that sense.
Okay, probably the final question in case unless any more come up. We have strict data protection regulations in the EU. Are the occupancy or utilization sensors compliant, and do they meet all the necessary standards?
We do. It is GDPR compliant. All the data that we generate is anonymous. It's non-identifiable data, and we store it in Europe. So we comply with all standards.
Okay, perfect. Hopefully that's helped people rest assured. We've actually reached the end of the questions sent in. So that's it from Daniel and myself. On behalf of both of us, thank you very much. Hope it's been useful, and we'll catch you for the next one.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Brilliant.